Welcome to Sunday Night on Asase 99.5 in Accra, 98.5 in Kumasi, 99.7 in Tamale, and 100.3 in Cape Coast. Also streaming globally on Facebook and later on YouTube on Asase Extra. We're the guests today of Professor Lesley Lokko, a practitioner of architecture, an educator, and also a woman who has been making waves recently as the curator of this year's Venice Architecture Biennale. Lesley Lokko is the founder of the African Futures Institute here in Accra, which she established in 2020 as a postgraduate school of architecture and a public events platform. She had some rather unusual beginnings, starting out studying Hebrew and Arabic, but soon put that course aside to move to the United States. Returning to the UK, though, she gained 2 degrees in architecture from the Bartlett School of Architecture at University College London, and went on to do a PhD in architecture at the University of London, gaining her degree in 2007. She founded the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg in 2015 and has taught on at least 5 continents: Australia, Europe, the UK, say off mainland Europe, the United States, as well as Africa. She was also based at the University of Cape Town for a while. She holds a string of awards for her contributions to architectural education, including the Annie Spink Award for Excellence in Education 2020, given to her by the Royal Institute of British Architects, and the 2021 Ada Louise Huxtable Prize for Contributions to Architecture, awarded by the Architectural Review. She is also, interestingly, a writer of fiction and has more than 10 novels to her credit, the first of which, Sundowners, published in 2004, was a Guardian Top 40 bestseller, and she has been described as the queen of the mega blockbuster. She's the editor of the anthology White Papers, Black Marks, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2000, and founded the journal Folio, dedicated to contemporary African architecture, which is one of her ventures at the African Futures Institute. She was named a Companion of the British Empire in the 2022 Queen's New Year Honours list. So, welcome to Asase.
Thank you very much. Quite a resume.
It is quite a resume, and one would hope that you're very proud of it. It's a bit daunting when it's set out all at once. But of course, it's been a lifetime of you exploring ideas in art and architecture, gaining qualifications, and indeed nurturing a new generation of people with an interest in art and design. Let's start at the beginning, though, because people will be curious about the woman even if they've heard about the public reputation. So you're the product of a transcontinental marriage. Yeah. Your father is Ghanaian and your mother Scottish. Tell us a little bit about childhood. You weren't born in Accra, were you?
No, so I was born in Scotland at the tail end of my father's studies, and as a medical doctor, and came to Ghana when I was 9 months. So I grew up here. I left here when I was 17. And I think a little bit unusually, my parents split up when I was quite young, and I was brought up by my father. So for me, Ghana was always home, and my father was always the dominant parent in the family. I didn't actually really have a relationship with my mother. And my father married a couple of times, so we had a couple of stepmothers. But I guess my formative years were very much about going back and forth. So we went back again when I was 6, and my father was doing further studies. So if I think about, the first, 10, 15 years, it was a lot of to and fro. It's kind of how I remember it, yeah.
So in a way, would you say the transcultural experience or the experience of different worlds was at the heart of the way you grew up and the culture in which you grew up?
I think so. And I think also because my parents' marriage was quite fractious, I think I learned very early on that culture is also a weapon. Language can also be a weapon, because my father would speak to us in Ga, my mother in English, so she would be excluded from conversation sometimes. So I think I had a sense that culture is not always the kind of benign kumbaya kind of paradigm, for want of a better word, that we think it is. But I also remember being very, very clear that I was half Ghanaian, half Scottish. And I often say that when I left Ghana at the age of 17 to go to boarding school in the UK, I left on British Caledonian as a half Ghanaian, half Scottish person. And when I arrived in England the next morning, I was black. And it wasn't that I didn't know what being black meant, but growing up here, it was much more about culture, about language, about traditions, about ritual, about food, there was much more to it than skin color. So when I arrived in the UK, that ordering of culture had to change. So I was black first, Ghanaian second, half Scottish third. There was a different hierarchy, if you like, yeah.
An extraordinary thing where, as you say, you come from a sense of culture being a lot more nuanced and having a lot more depth to it, being almost about facades.
Yep.
And the way you appear to people being the way they define you instantly.
Absolutely, yeah.
For some people coming from the product, particularly the generation that we come from of transcontinental families, sometimes there's also an issue of class. So you come from a very prominent Ghanaian, I think originally Danish family. The Lokko is a well-known Lokko Road,
Yes.
and indeed a different Lokko house, not the Lokko house with which you're associated, which I hope we'll talk about later, very well known. Now a very Shishi part of Accra, originally known as Usuashanti, quite close to Christiansborg.
Yeah.
In the years that you were growing up here in Ghana, did you have a sense of being steeped in the landscape, having a family connection to certain parts of the built environment?
You know, my dad was a doctor in the army, so I actually grew up in Burma camp. And I think I probably identified as a child of an army officer more than a child of a local. And my father, for reasons, I mean, he's passed away 10 years now, for reasons that are best known to himself, didn't integrate us with his family much. You know, my grandmother came to the house every Sunday. We had a fairly strong relationship with her, but she always came to us. My cousins occasionally used to come and work in the house because my dad used to pay their school fees. So there was always a class distinction between us being the children of a doctor and the rest of his family. My mother was very working class British. And I think the joke in a way was that she had come to Ghana having moved upper class, marrying a doctor. And here she was considered a catch because she was white. But actually, in terms of education and background, my father was very much the kind of educated middle class, even though culturally he wasn't middle class. So I think I understood very, very early on that class and culture are intertwined, but they're also complicated by factors of race and geography. And to be one thing in Ghana, I mean, growing up, I was always Obroni. All mixed race kids were culturally white, I think, and I think that's fairly accurate. And then you'd get back to the UK or to France or the United States or whatever, and you'd be in a completely different class position. So I think I understood, even before I had language, that these things are relative, number one, and also very complex. So depending on where you are, depending on what the race-class dynamic in that particular location is, you move in and out of those things quite fluidly. So I think my earliest memories of things like race, class, and culture was that they're all phenomenally unstable.
Quite a volatile and explosive mix, almost.
I think so, and I mean, it took a long time to, I don't want to say make peace with it, but to be able to process it. Because also, the way you experience it is, certainly I did, was generally through aggression or defensiveness or name calling or envy. I mean, there was a lot of those kind of quite complex emotions swirling in the mix. And in order to be able to process that, you have to have a fairly sophisticated understanding of, I guess, emotional understanding, and that takes time. So I think, you know, my sort of teenage and early 20s were very confused, I think. And I think that's common to many people who come from this kind of complexity.
So a fraught cultural background, but at the same time a very enriching one,
Mm.
because even if you were distanced from it, there was, I presume, a very particular culture within Burma Camp, some of which I'm familiar. My mother taught in Burma Camp.
Okay. I went, yeah.
Small world.
Yeah.
But a very particular culture within Burma Camp. There were other families that came from similarly mixed race backgrounds, with
Yep.
specifically army, doctors,
Yep.
Anil family,
Exactly,
and so
yeah.
on. So there was a sense of a milieu, however small it was, to which you belonged. You went to Ghana International School, where, again, you will have been exposed to a range of people from across the world, famously the school where most diplomats sent their children for primary school education, and must have developed, as you said, this finely tuned sense to the way cultural difference can affect life.
No, absolutely. I mean, I went to services primary in Burma Camp, and you said, well, your mother taught, and then I went to Ridge Church. So I went to Ridge Church Primary School and then went to GIS for Form 1. And my dad had intended to send me to Achimota. So most of the kids in Burma Camp went to, Achimota or, Wesley Girls or Aburi, schools like that. And I remember one night my dad sat me down and said, I've decided to send you to the international school. And I cried in fear. And he was, why are you crying? And number one, all of my friends were going to Achimota or Aburi Girls. But number two, all I knew about GIS was that there were no black people. So I was petrified. And I remember in Form 1, there was one other mixed race kid in class. I don't think there was a single full Ghanaian in my Form 1 year. The rest were, Norwegians, Danes, Americans, whatever. And it was a bit like being thrown, it was almost gladiatorial. And I remember it was the year when it was decided that all Ghanaian children would sing the pledge. But if you were not Ghanaian, you didn't have to. And Mrs. Akwa, who was the headmistress at the time, was married to a Ghanaian and was very determined that every Ghanaian in the school would sing it. So we'd start the morning in assembly and all the mixed race kids would be mumbling the pledge because everybody else would be laughing at you. And I remember just thinking the disjunction of being in your own country, being somehow made to feel ashamed of your own culture in your own home. That was a very, very unsettling experience for me. And then by Form 3, there was a wave of Ghanaians who came into GIS and it changed the school profoundly. And so from Form 3, 4, and 5, it was a very, very different school. But the first 2 years for me were really hard. Yeah.
So you go from that to a boarding school experience in the UK, where, as you say, for the first time, you have people defining you almost entirely, at least at first blush, by what they think you look like, and where they think you come from. Much later on in a different life, having survived that environment, gone through academia, in June 2019, you were named the Dean of Architecture at the Bernard and Spitzer School of Architecture at City College of New York. But you resigned abruptly the following year, 10 months into the job, to launch the African Futures Institute here in Accra. Now, at the time, you were the poster child, having survived this cultural crush, for a bold new idea of ability to push the cultural boundaries forward. You were one of the most prominent of just the 4% of deans of architecture in United States colleges that identify as African American or African in an overwhelmingly white sea of academia. But she described stepping down at the time as a profound act of self-preservation. It was a difficult time. COVID had just happened. The school closed down something like 3 months after you taking up the appointment. And you suddenly found yourself overwhelmed by administrative demands with very little support, you've described as. Perhaps you'll talk a little bit about that, but I wanted to ask you what role race played specifically in your decision to step down.
And it's a really good question, and actually a really complicated question. And I think in the aftermath of the resignation, a lot of people assumed that I was talking about the kind of overt racism that often gets called out. And I was actually talking about something that was much more buried. And I think there is in the US, and this is, I'm going to try and explain this in as clear a way as I possibly can. The figure of Black women is a complicated one. On the one hand, especially light-skinned Black women, you are identified with the house slave, the person who is in the domestic realm, possibly taking care of children, taking care of the household, a cut above those working in the field, kind of half trusted with the secrets or the intimacies of the family, but at the same time not part of it. It's a complicated figure. And I say that that figure exists in literature, it exists in films, it exists in the psyche. I think the sort of modern day incarnation of it, the Oprah Winfrey, is also, and I'm not referring, I don't mean to say that Oprah Winfrey is that kind of figure, but it's a very, very powerful image of a Black woman. And again, it's a caretaker kind of image. It's somebody who takes care, somebody who has an ocean of empathy that comes from the history and the experiences, but it's essentially a caring figure.
You're talking about the mammy figure to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, but I mean, it can also be a very powerful figure because the projections about escaping slavery and, someone like Oprah has done so incredibly well and one of the richest women, etc. So it's a very, very complicated dynamic. And there's a kind of fragility around people who are in the presence of those types of people because they both hold but also wield incredible power. When I got to the States, I found out, or I came to understand that the capacity or the projected capacity for me to work was almost limitless. In other words, I could work 24 hours a day. That was what my role was. And it was partly being a female dean because, the dean is very much a kind of figurehead. But in a situation like COVID, where everyone's grappling with something for the first time, they're not quite sure what they're doing, I was expected to grapple with that, manage the emotional burdens that people were carrying, manage the fear, manage the legal fear around the institution, manage the insecurity of the students. There was an incredible amount to hold. And what I found was that people expected that I would hold that because they expected that I would know how to hold that. And what I wanted to say is that wherever you have race, gender, and labor in the US, you will have some very complicated emotions running around. And that's what I wanted to protect myself against. I don't come from that tradition. I don't come from that history. And I also don't come from that capacity, to be really honest. When I resigned, I remember getting a letter, and I still have it I got lots of emails, good and bad. But I got this one email from a woman who was the legal counsel for a private college somewhere in New England, obviously African American, and she said, dear professor, I wanted to write and reach out to you. She said, my daughter and I had a fight the other night about you. I was thinking, why you emailed me this? And she said, my daughter was convinced you were a millennial. And I was trying to tell my daughter there was no way you could be a millennial. Like deans are usually much older than millennials. Why do you think she's a millennial? And the daughter says she has a very strong sense of her own self-worth. And her mother said, who I'm assuming was around my age, she said, it made me realize how complicit I have been in my own, I think she used the word oppression. And that was very sobering for me because it made me realize, okay, that's what the vast majority of African American women have had to do, is essentially suck it up. You work longer hours, you work more intensively, you make do with less support, you make do with less resources, because that's just what Black women do. And at the same time, you take care of the insecurity and the fragility and the aggression. I mean, God save me from liberal white women. Save me. I left that experience thinking, never again. And
Specifically liberal white women.
Yeah, I am still angry about it. Yeah. And it's taken a long time to be able to understand that it's actually not personal. You know, exactly as you were saying in the beginning, when someone outside of Africa encounters you, they encounter you through the veil of their own presumptions about you. That's something that you're very free of here. I mean, yes, there's some class assumptions about being mixed race and so on, but by and large, those are fairly superficial here. Outside, overseas, it is deep, and it takes an incredible amount of energy to work through it. And invariably, that energy is energy that I have to expend. Everybody else is fairly happy with, you know, where they are because they're not decentered. They're still in the kind of orbit of the world as they know it. Yeah.
An orbit of the world that seems to have been carved out for them and generations before them, and into which they fit easily, whereas you are this new quantity that comes into the equation.
Absolutely. And I think that the new quantity, or the new the interloper, I think is the way I would describe it. You know, and I say this about, curiously, it's what makes Black and African students of architecture really good. It's an odd conundrum. But that quality of being both the person who is looking and the person who is being looked at, when it's Du Bois's double consciousness. In architecture, it's a very useful, I don't want to use the word trick because it's not tricksy, but that ability to step inside and outside of yourself in architecture is really, actually in all creative fields, is incredibly powerful. I think those of us who come from that background where it's as natural as breathing, you know, you just understand yourself as an object in the world, but also as the subjective person in the world. It's just become part of the way you work. And that ability to see things from both the inside and the outside, I think is really powerful. But again, it takes quite a long time to recognize it as a source of power or strength, and not as an Achilles heel.
Mm. Also a curious time to take over the leadership of the Spitzer School, because I believe for a period of something like 4 years before your appointment, there hadn't been a dean of the school. And that must have come with a weight of expectations in its own right that complicated matters. Having taken the decision to stand down, you said you had an avalanche of emails, I'm sure personal letters, personal responses. At the time, though, because it's a big step to take, and some people might have seen it almost as an admission of defeat.
Oh, yeah.
You must have been exhausted with all the demands that there'd been on you mentally, emotionally, physically, in terms of your time doing, as you said, what Black women do, which is you just maintain.
Yeah.
You're paddling like furious underneath, but you make it look effortless and you just bulldoze your way through it. Did you feel crushed by the experience, or what gave you the ebullience, the spring back that allowed you to say, I'm going to move to Accra and set up the African Futures Institute, or was it not as deliberate as that?
Well, you know, I'd been at the School of Architecture in Johannesburg and had done pretty much the same thing, and, you know, taken an existing master's program and then founded a school. And it happened after the student protests in South Africa, so the kind of context was very ready for a different approach, and the school was great. But the same workload problems, the same administrative problems plagued me there that I just walked into again in Johannesburg. And oddly enough, not oddly enough, they're the same problems I have with the African Futures Institute, the inability to build an administrative and logistical infrastructure. It's crippling. But my sister died, I was very, very close to in 2019, and then 7 weeks later, my brother died. So there were two really big losses in Joburg in 2019. And so the decision to move was also partly prompted by, like, if I stay here in Johannesburg working 18 hours a day, I'm probably going to be the next one to go. And I was headhunted to move to New York, and there was a choice between going to New York or going to Australia. And I have one full sister left who lives in Oxford, and I just thought, you know, having just lost two siblings, and you go from being a family of, you know, 4 to a family of 2, I just thought Australia was a stretch too far. And I think maybe within a week of landing in New York, I realized I was frying pan to fire. And this was actually before COVID started. And I think, as you pointed out, you know, any institution that's been without leadership for an extended period of time, it just slides into dysfunction. I mean, that's just the way of human beings. So I walked into a phenomenally dysfunctional institutional environment that was complicated by the fact of being the first Black woman, being a foreigner, trying to implement curriculum changes that I knew would be in the interests of the students to take on board, but would not be in the interest of the faculty. And it was the first time I'd worked in the US kind of tenure environment. You know, tenure is protected by God. So the possibility of actually making change, I mean, it was less than zero, because you'd have had to essentially sack everybody. And I found out a little bit later on that one of the main problems with the curricular changes that I wanted to implement was that we couldn't financially map this new teaching methodology onto an existing financial academic credit system. There was just no way for the two systems to overlap. And actually what drives, education in the United States is its finances. And now in order to understand how to do that, I would literally have had to train as an accountant. And so the things that seemed really, bring change, transformation, transformative pedagogy, inclusivity, diversity, XYZ, I mean, those are the sort of surface things. The systemic, structural forces underneath, that's something else altogether. So once I'd realized that, I just thought, actually, there's no place on this planet that you're going to be able to implement these changes in meaningful ways other than at home. And I left the US, went to Edinburgh for about 6 months, and I was walking through Edinburgh University one day, and I saw a billboard for the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and I literally thought, that's it. African Futures. Ford Foundation came on board, Mellon Foundation came on board very early and gave me enough seed money to actually start it, but I had no clear idea that that's what I was going to do. And then I got here, and, after 3 years, I mean, the Biennale kind of interrupted it. I'm kind of back where I started, which is I can't build the administrative infrastructure that will allow an institute to flourish. So it has occurred to me that, I've been critical of institutes for 30 years. And here I am towards the end of my career trying to replicate another one.
Surely not at the end of your career. We hope you've got a...
Oh, I don't know. I'm so ready for retirement. Got nothing to retire to, but I don't want to be doing this all the time. But I realize now, actually, the model that I'm trying to implement is flawed. It's not the right model for what I would like, or the changes that I would like to see. There needs to be another model.
Well, you describe the peculiar difficulties of trying to change the curriculum in a US setting. To people on the outside, it might sound extraordinary with the superficial notion of the way US academic systems work. They seem endlessly malleable, the ability to combine subjects of all different sorts. But as you said, usually based on some very shrewd thinking, which is about numbers, essentially.
Yeah.
And anything that upsets those numbers would be an interference. In South Africa, though, we glossed over that slightly. Setting up the Graduate School of Architecture there, presumably you have the upturning of an old apartheid system. But what were the difficulties with introducing a new idea of how the curriculum worked there? Or did you find it was, other than the workload, it was a pretty seamless process?
I wouldn't say it was seamless, but I mean, one of the things that I've always appreciated about South Africa is that there is a willingness, and in fact, willingness is the wrong word. There is no escaping the history. So the issues around race, identity, land, ownership, power, they're right there at the surface. And in some ways it makes it an exhausting place to be, but it's also incredibly exhilarating. The appetite for change was already there. It was, the decolonization conversation started in 2014 and it just kind of swept through. So in some senses, it wasn't difficult to make the case for change in the same way that it is in the United States. The US is a kind of Panglossian, we're the best of all possible worlds. Why on earth would you want to change anything? South Africa is like, we have to change. So getting permission, in inverted commas, to make the changes was not difficult. what was difficult in South Africa was doing it single-handedly. So at the same time that you're trying to build a school and build a new generation of teachers, kind of a pipeline, you're having to deal with, making sure there's enough toilet paper in the toilets and, picking people up from the airport when they come to visit and fundraising. And it was just endless. And my standards are high. And to that accusation, I always say, well, at least I have them. But it's also because invariably in the changes I've tried to make, I've had to go out to philanthropy to support them financially. And when you start taking other people's money, not state money, when you start looking for donors and for funders, especially if those donors and funders are external to where you are, they have no idea that every morning you're the person here putting petrol in the generator or making sure that the MTN has been paid. That is not in their frame because that's just not the way they think. So you wind up at the coalface of doing all of that, but at the same time, the duck paddling to maintain the image of forward motion that's going to keep funders interested and invested in what you're doing. And in South Africa, I found that for me was the hard bit because the funders were sometimes directly university councils or there were, grants for new institutes within existing education. They were sometimes from the private sector. So I was forward facing all the time, but at the same time having to back face constantly. And the students were phenomenal. Phenomenal. I love teaching. And it was, a source of the most incredible joy to see so many of those students at the Biennale. I mean, they're now graduates and so on, but you could really see that a pipeline of thinking 10 years ago has absolutely paid dividends. And it's the same in a sense with the AFI. So when I was appointed the curator, I just thought, there's no way. Curators of the Biennale are people who have huge offices. They have schools behind them. There was me, a cleaner, and a driver. And I remember saying to the Biennale team, I've got no resources. They were like, no, we'll help you. So then I had to fundraise to go and buy in a team, people I didn't know. And you have to build, you make the road as you walk it, which is, I also think it's just the way of it. You can't really complain about it. That's just how it is. But to the outside, no one knows that. So the curator normally comes with their own infrastructure. So they're usually people at the top of their careers. They've got offices of, 100 people or whatever it is. They come with ballast. I came with a cleaner and a driver. So that gap between, again, what the thing looks like to the outside world and actually what it is on a day-to-day basis it's chalk and cheese. And, trying to run the Biennale at the same time I was trying to grow this startup here, in the end, it was just impossible. So I decided I'm going to put the academic program on hold. I'm going to focus on the public events. But, even the public events, just getting the finances, the legal systems, it is 20 hours a day. And so, having delivered the Biennale now, I came home, whatever it was, 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I recognized, okay, it's time to really rethink this. And there is another way to accomplish some of what I wanted to do with the African Futures Institute, just not in the form of an institute. I will wait for 20 years to get an educational license in Ghana before I'll even admit one student. The hoops that I would have to go through for accreditation and validation, I'd be doing this for the next 20 years. So there's got to be a different way to bring about change. And I don't think it's going to be done in that institutional, organizational way.
It sounds, in a way, extraordinarily disappointing for something that is so, as you said, forward-facing and so very much about the idea of moving on with the idea of cultural exchange, cultural dialogue, making new things, new environments, new settings, maybe even a whole new way of imagining the future or imagining the built environment. That you're suggesting that in order to have the kind of weight that it takes to survive in the Ghanaian environment, you still need the approbation of the establishment.
Yeah, architecture is a really interesting discipline because it's also a professional discipline. So it's got this, it sits right at the intersection between the job of the university, which is to produce new knowledge, and the job of the profession, which is to produce competencies. So it sits right in that, like a lot of professions do, right in that crack, and it's professionally validated. So you can't call yourself an architect unless you're licensed, in the same way you can't call yourself a doctor. So you've always got, in training an architect, you essentially have two masters. One is the university and one is the profession. And the profession regulates the university through the accreditation and the validation processes. So it's a tricky subject to try and introduce too much change, because that tension between risk and exploration, risk management and exploration, is always there. What architecture does offer, though, is individuals can make enormous changes. So having, if I'd done the Biennale 15 years ago and I'd said, look, I want to foreground Africa, I'd have been scrabbling around for 3 or 4 architects. Today, there are 300. In some senses, I was spoilt for choice in terms of who I could select. And that has radically been down to the differences in education, maybe not so much in Ghana, but certainly in many other places, that has allowed people to kind of come through with very strong ideas, very strong visions, very strong visual interpretations of a different kind of world. And that is beginning to gather force. So the way I look at it now, rather than try and educate 100 people over 2 years, if you educated 10, you would probably have relatively the same impact. So the question now is not so much about putting an institution in place that has all the tick boxes and the validation and all the infrastructure and the finance and the legal departments and HR and all the stuff that you need to do in order to maintain an institute. Now it's much more about teaching directly and selecting a group of 10 or 15 students every year, finding the funding to teach them outside of the university framework and allowing them to start making these changes. I'm 60 now. Like, I'm literally going to run out of steam. So I don't want to spend the next 10 years actually just fighting with the photocopier and the generator and, all of the stuff that I kind of spend my life doing. I sort of think there's an urgency now that you really enjoy teaching, and that's where you can make a difference. So figure out the framework in which you can teach students and teach them directly.
I find that very interesting also because you're only the 3rd or the 4th, depending on how you want to see it, woman asked to curate the Architecture Biennale in Venice. There was Japanese architect
Sejima.
in Kazuyo Sejima in 2010, and then Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara in 2018. Notably, Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara, Irish architects, had spent nearly 30 years in teaching at University College Dublin before they went on to curate the 16th exhibition. Do you think that that is one of the peculiar points or the peculiar features about being a woman in architecture, that in order to have the kind of impact that you want on ideas, thinking, practice, you always have to be concerned about the teaching element, the bringing on of a generation of people who hopefully are the conduit for spreading the ideas, rather than doing what a generation of Ghanaian men, increasingly known for their work in architectural practice. I'm sure it involves a certain amount of teaching, but it's not seen as the main point of the way they work within the profession.
I mean, I think for a lot of women, teaching architecture offers a kind of stopgap, in the years when you might be raising a family and you're not in the office 12 hours a day, because architecture is quite demanding in that way. So there's a kind of a period of 10 or 15 years where you're not at the, if you have a family, you're not at the kind of coal face of practice. So teaching has often offered a kind of safe space, in a sense, to stay connected, to stay in touch with ideas, but to allow you to have a kind of, let's call it a normal life outside of it. So I think there's the percentage of women who teach is probably higher. And I'm not talking about straight academics. I'm talking about people who are practitioners who do a bit of both. But I think anyone who's interested in change, and Black Lives Matter was a really important moment. People are now sort of saying it's coming to an end, but it was a really important moment, certainly in architectural education, because suddenly the conversations around the relationship between racial justice, social justice, environmental justice couldn't be kept outside. I think most of my training as an architect, those concerns were very much peripheral. Now suddenly the concerns were center stage, and climate change has given urgency, a greater urgency to the idea of change in general. And because of the conflation of race, social, and environmental change, we're now beginning to talk about those things as if they're connected, which they are. So, in a strange way, what's happened over the past 3 or 4 years has sort of opened up a door. But I've always said that if you are really serious about difference, it's epistemological. It's to do with different ways of being in the world. It's about different languages. It's about different approaches. It's about a different register. And you won't get that by hiring 2 Black faculty and 7 Black students and then teaching them in exactly the same way. You've missed an opportunity to really examine the roots of knowledge. And I think that's what Africa has to offer the rest of the world, is a different way to be in the world. And so long as those ways of being are relegated to the margins, they're not part of mainstream architectural education, either there or here, the thing that so many students and young practitioners are longing for, which is a space in architecture to be their authentic selves, will always escape us. And to be angry about something, I say this endlessly, is only the first step. We need so much beyond that. It can't always only be about protest. It has to be about imagination, about creativity, about expansion, about ingenuity. And to get people to the place where they're able to take full advantage of that, they have to be confident. The vast majority of African and Black students are not confident, not because they're not good or they're not talented. It's because the systems that support them do not support that same confidence. And that's on us. That's not them. If we as educators and practitioners and curators cannot find it with all of the horsepower that we have at our disposal to think about offering different kinds of platforms, I don't know, what are we doing? Yeah. That's my take on it, yeah.
But it's something you very much tried to push against with the program that you've put together for this year's Architecture Biennale. You spoke in passing earlier on about the difference between how you see new ideas working in the Ghanaian setting and maybe the way they're working elsewhere in Africa. You have your experience from South Africa to draw on, and obviously now, as you say, you can see at least 2 generations of students who've passed through African training systems for architecture who maybe are trying to do something different. Now, a central theme of your selection of exhibits for this year has been essentially the idea of sustainability, decolonization, and decarbonization, the central importance of climate change as you see it to the way we think about our built and our lived environment. Where for you in Africa are the gleams, the sparks of fantastic ideas you see coming through that give you confidence that that's a new model that the world could begin to switch on to?
So in the exhibition in the Biennale, we had a whole category called Guests from the Future, and they were what they call curator special projects. So the relationship that I had to them was quite intense. Many of the other participants, you sort of select them and then they go off and they do their thing and then they're in the competition. But curator special projects are considered out of competition because of the relationship or the shared interest with the curator. And I was inspired by the account of a meeting in 1945 between the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova and Isaiah Berlin, who was a British philosopher at the time, was working for the British embassy in Moscow. And they met in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and she was 57 and he was 35. And they talked for 12 hours straight, and they never said what it was that they talked about. So there was never any account published of this meeting. But when he left, and there was no indication that they'd had an affair or anything like that, but when he left, she wrote a stanza in one of her most famous poems where she called him a man strayed from the future. So when I was thinking about what this category of architects that I was interested in showcasing in a way could be, I kept thinking about them as guests from the future, because there's something about the way in which they practice that's not quite of this world, but at the same time, it's not out of this world. They're sort of taking elements of the world that we know, partly because of their age, but also their complex cultural DNA, are able to see connections in things that I can't see at first. So we had a group of 22 of them, and they were called the guests from the future, and they are threaded throughout the exhibition. So they're always in dialogue with existing practitioners, people with big practices, and their work for me is super interesting. And I think it's been the work that has also put the cat amongst the pigeons for many architects who look at it and think, well, it's not architecture. I don't see a building. I don't see traditional means of representation. I don't see things that I know. But what's for me very unique about these practitioners is that there's something very specific to who they are, where they're from, the fact that they generally speak more than one language, that they live in two worlds at the same time, that they are having this endless traffic between the future and the present and the past, and between Africa and here and there and the diaspora. There's something about that condition that makes their work very different, and you can't identify that work until it comes out. So working with them for me was very interesting, because they would say, well, I want to do this, and I'd think, okay, sure. And we also had to fundraise, because most of these practitioners don't have the means to do it. So quite a complex project. And when they started making stuff, visual stuff, or the sound recordings, or sculptures, or material investigations, what was amazing to me was every single time something would pop up on my screen, I would think, that's not what I expected you to do. But now that I've seen it, I know I can see absolutely that is what you should do. So for me, it was an incredible affirmation of the fact that if you give somebody the platform, you don't have to know what it is that they're going to produce. You have to trust that they will be able to produce it. And in 22 cases, that's exactly what they did, time after time. So for me, the magic, the alchemy of my generation being able to say, look, I can provide this, a certain amount of funding, an exhibitor's space, shipping, bit of insurance, some guidance, a few emails. You cook with that, and they do every time.
The assumption is that when you're talking about the African setting, when you're talking about creativity, it always has to be linked to some kind of idea of the utilitarian, the actual object. Now, you are unusual in the sense that, yes, you have focused largely on architecture, art, and design education, but you have also realized your own projects. You have actually built, including your first commissioned project, I believe it is, Lokko House, not the Lokko House, the design store, the concept store. Tell us a little bit about the thinking that went into that, your creation of a house, and what you were trying to do that was form-breaking there in the way of these 22 special project artists you worked with in Venice.
So it's quite an unusual thing for an architect to be able to build their own house. Like, a lot of architects will say that that's the worst possible brief, is that when you are asked to build a house for yourself, you don't know what to build. And I had started writing fiction. So I'd left architecture kind of in a formal way, and I was writing full time. But I was still doing a PhD in architecture, and I did a PhD that allowed you to do a design project as part of your investigation. So I used the money that I was making from fiction writing to buy a piece of land and to build my own house, and then use the house as part of the dissertation project. So it was kind of circular in a way. And there were two things I was interested in. One was the skin of the building. So I had an idea that I wanted to use a material that was breathable. And it's to do with the relationship between African art practices and oral histories. So in many other parts of the world, architecture is this kind of silent, it's a sort of a dumb history. It's a history that can't speak. So you make a monument to represent something. And I mean, that's one role of architecture, you could say. Text, writing history in text format is also another way of formalizing it, and it's separate from the body somehow. But in Africa, much of history is within the body. It's in oral histories, scarification and cicatrice and tattooing. These are things that show that the relationship between history and the past it's inscribed literally on the body. So I wanted to think about a building in which the skin of the building would be more live than organic, let's say, than cement. And so Alero and I started talking about using mud.
This is Alero
Olympia, yeah. So she gave me her mud making machine and her masons who came from Togo. And we built the bricks. We excavated the soil from the ground, and part of that soil went into making. So you dug, and then you started making the bricks
from the site.
From the site itself, yeah. So there was some really kind of interesting relationship between breaking the earth and then using that earth in order to make the building. So that was kind of interesting. And then the second thing was a conversation I had with my father many years before that. And one of the things that was most difficult for me to understand in architecture is this term program. It took me about 3 years as a student to really understand what program means. And roughly speaking, it's what goes on in the building. So the program of a hospital is healing, or the program of a church is spirituality, or the program of a house is living. So the layout and the materials and the form all serves what the building is supposed to be doing.
Sort of the purpose.
In a way, yeah. And I remember talking to my dad about the purpose of a corridor. And the corridor is a Victorian invention that allowed members of the same family living in the same spaces to have privacy from one another because the corridor bypassed the bedrooms. And my dad and I were talking, and he sort of said, in that case, the hallway in an African house should be the biggest space of all, because the hallway is the place where, in most African cultures, the greeting is very important. And in a European sense, the hallway is this kind of small interstitial space between the outside and the inside. And that really odd conversation got me thinking about what would the program for a middle-aged, single African woman be? Like, what would that living space be? And in the end, it was a single space that only had one room, which was the toilet or the bathroom. So there was something that I was trying to explore in the building that was very much related to the questions I was asking myself about architecture.
So it's one open plan living space.
Completely.
Only the bathroom.
Only the bathroom was the only door. And in some ways, it's not so radical. I mean, you go into any loft anywhere in the world, it's pretty much the same thing. But it was quite unusual for here. Mm. And people who would come to see the house would, eventually say to my father, but it's so disappointing, your daughter has gone to make money and she just had this small house with one room. And it's made of mud. So there was quite a lot of conversation about how disappointing. Yeah, like how it's not nice. But I really enjoyed living there. And curiously, when I left it and I sold the house, I've never thought about it again.
How long did you live there for?
I lived there for about 8 years. And I think it's something that, an architect, you build a house, but you can always build another one. So even though I was invested in it and I really liked it, when I left, I never thought about it again. And everyone kept saying, it would be really hard to leave your house. And actually it wasn't. Yeah, very, very weird.
But it is some kind of classic making a statement, as you said, about living space, the shape of a living space, what is a workable, practical living space, as well as you said, the skin of the building being almost indistinguishable from
the ground
on which it sits, and being porous, so having that natural relation with its own environment.
Absolutely. And what we actually wanted to do with the walls of the building was I wanted to scar them in a way that would kind of pick up on the scarification and cicatrice. But we had to seal the walls against rainfall. And if we had scarred them, it would have left little cracks and fissures for moisture to enter, so it wasn't practical. But there were so many things about building when we built it in a cavity wall construction to cut down on the humidity and then passed all the services through. But then the masons found these seed pods, and they couldn't name the tree, but they just knew. When they saw the tree, they knew what tree it was. And they cracked open these seed pods and boiled the seeds. And the goop or the glue that came out of it was mixed with paint. like a thin, like a clear paint, and that's what the muds was plastered with, and we never repainted it. And there was one portion of the wall that was cement because that's where the water services ran. Was painting that every year. It's really fun. Yeah.
So it worked perfectly as a sealant for the walls.
Perfectly.
And making use of local knowledge and,
Yep.
if you like, techniques that must have been long lost because we have fallen in love with this idea of modern and lost our own heritage of.
And I mean, I had a polished concrete floor, and in Europe or the United States, you have a machine that kind of vibrates the floor to get the concrete completely smooth. We didn't have that machine. So the masons polished it by hand. And of course, the hand is not completely flat. So what happened over time is that the floor began to get this texture that looked a little bit like velvet. And after about a year of polishing it with, mansion wax or whatever, the floor surface, it was stunning. And you just saw these just very, very tiny variations. And every once in a while, there'd be something that looked a little bit like the thumb pad. And so the floor itself had this quality of being like alive. I don't know how to describe it. And those are things that I had no idea of in the beginning. And that's kind of what happened. Yeah. We don't have here the kind of obsession with the preservation of the past that you see in many other places. And there's a kind of nostalgia in other places, even in other post-colonial societies. I'm thinking of places like Cuba, the Caribbean. There's a kind of nostalgia for a kind of a bygone richness or
a golden era.
Yeah, that also drives a lot of the preservation dialogue in parts of the city, and that's what tourists come to see, and that's what they love. But the kind of contemporary reality of it is not what people want to see. So there's something about that dialogue about heritage and investment in tourism that's a little bit I'm a bit ambivalent about. But at the same time, there's some relationship here between decay that I think we haven't got right. So it's as if the only two options are you preserve it or you let it decay. And when I see the state of decay, it seems to me to be a state of neglect. It's not even purposeful. And that's problematic because I think if you are not going to glorify your past, figure out another way to deal with the past, that it's not simply disintegrating in front of your eyes. And that conversation we're not having in architecture schools. We're not talking about ways to treat the past, to deal with the past in innovative ways. I was reading somewhere the other day that I think it's in Holland, the building industry is now trying to put through measures that when you demolish a building, you demolish it very, very carefully to extract as much usable components out of the building as you possibly can. So you take out window frames and you reuse them and so on. Now, that's a very different approach to demolition than the knocking ball, which is kind of what developers go for because it takes you 20 minutes to knock down a building, but 20 years to build it. So somehow in the codes around demolition, you're able to insert an attitude towards sustainability, towards longevity, let's say. We don't even have those conversations here. And when you look around the built environment in the tropics, and I think it's one of the things that people don't really understand about the tropics, is that building materials fight to maintain equilibrium here. You're fighting heat and humidity, which are the two kind of, I don't want to call them enemies because I think they can also add things to it, but we never speak about that. So, there's a kind of obsession with glass and steel and a certain image of modernity that we equate with progress. And not realizing, I think, that it's not the conversation about whether things are sustainable or not, as in a kind of scientific sustainability, but actually culturally, historically, emotionally, how are these things sustainable? And until we take charge of that discourse, and I say we as in Africa, no one's going to take charge of it for us. And it goes back to me to that sense of unconfidence. And I think it's very, very particular to post-colonial societies, not just Ghana, where the challenge is always to master the master's language, to be as accurate and efficient and as competent as possible, not realizing that there are other forms of knowledge and competency and excellence that have nothing to do with the master's language. But somehow I think education is the place where you can support and sustain and nurture that kind of approach. That's why I think that, you know, for Africa, education is our battleground. It's the coalface of the 22nd century.
I'm not sure that it feels like the pinnacle of your career, being the curator of the Venice Architecture Biennale this year, but it certainly is a height that few other people have reached. Certainly not people with the kind of cultural background you come from, and it's an achievement, of course, being a woman. You've done yourself proud. You've done an awful lot of other people proud. Where next, other than the African Futures Institute, for Lesley Lokko?
I have another novel. So I actually have rented a place in my favorite writing place, which is Edinburgh. So I will be writing a novel from January until May next year, and I already know what the novel will be about, and there will be a Biennale in it, and a murder.
A Biennale and a murder.
Yeah.
So this is The Lonely Hour, is it?
It is, yes.
It is.
Yeah. Well, God, you've done your homework, blimey. Yeah, so that's coming out. I think it'll be out in 2025. So that's going to be for me, very interesting period of, 4 months of kind of reflection on what this has been. I love teaching. It remains for me the biggest passion in architecture. So I'm thinking with a couple of partners how we develop the idea of a studio, a nomadic studio that takes place every year on the African continent. So we're sort of thinking about how we put that together. And I think that's what the African Futures Institute, I think that we will drop the institute part of it. I think that's what it's going to morph into. Yeah.
We look forward to that. The traveling, the mobile school.
The nomadic school, yes.
The nomadic school of ideas, which sounds wonderful, whether on camelback or whether in a Land Rover, as we've recently been talking to other people about on Sunday night. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was so enjoyable. It was great.
And here's to futures. We hope that when you set up your mobile library, you'll come and tell us what it's like and how it's working out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We have been the guests of Professor Lesley Lokko, the architect, the trainer and teacher of architecture, who's been telling us about the ferment of ideas from which her own architectural practice and her teaching in architecture has come, and her ideas of where next for art and design in Africa. It's been a very enjoyable conversation, and our great thanks to her for being so generous with her time. Join us again on Sunday night again next week at the same time for more wonderful tales of this land we call the African diaspora.